Conservative populist president loses election to Liberal rival, refuses to accept result. Conservative populist president conspires to incite a violent revolt intended to thwart the inauguration of his successor, deny the will of the people and overturn the constitutional order. The insurrection fails. Here is where it gets a bit choose your own adventure. Do you? 1. Drag your feet investigating, never mind prosecuting, any case for treason or adjacent offences against the former president, whether out of incompetence, disorganisation or fear of inflaming his seething supporters even further, and allow him to run for and win re-election 4 years later, even angrier and more vindictive than previously. Or 2. Put the former president in the dock as one would any other accused criminal, hear arguments for guilt or innocence, decide on the balance of evidence to convict, then lock him up for 27 years, with a further 8-year ban from holding public office, lest he decides to run again when a free man in his late 90s. US President Donald Trump did stand trial and was convicted on charges which did not pertain to the ransacking of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021, but never had to answer in court for his attempted putsch. Former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro was convicted last week of plotting a coup d'etat, and this week, as long as we're comparing and contrasting, was also fined 1 million Brazilian reals, or about 160,000 euros, for making racist jokes while in office. In Democracies, it is an article of faith that nobody, not even the national leader, is above the law. As with most articles of faith, expedient exceptions are made. How and why has Brazil done what the United States did not, or could not? How different might the US be now if it had? And what are the consequences of a country allowing a leader to get away with stuff over and over again? This is the Foreign Desk.
I think Brazil took quite a brave step in today's world. But depending on the result of next year's presidential elections, things they can change.
There was a tremendous view, mostly amongst the people who voted for Charlie Haughey, that if Haughey could live in these circumstances, well, then perhaps I could live in them as well.
I don't think that most Americans want a king, but I think many Americans are so scared of the other side that they do not want the other side in power.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Muller, and I'm joined, first of all, by Monocle senior correspondent and Brazil desk chief, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Fernando, obviously you've been following this story very closely. I want to go back first, though, to before the trial and conviction. What kind of arguments were there in Brazil over whether to actually prosecute Bolsonaro or, in the interests of national unity, reconciliation, etc., just kind of letting it drop?
I think Brazil had a decision to make, and usually we're the country that say, let's unite the nation and give amnesty to everything that happened. That classically happened after the dictatorship, unlike Chile and Argentina, which had a different approach. The military went on trial. That didn't quite happen in Brazil at the time. So there were a lot of proof, of course. Bolsonaro has been sentenced that he was planning a coup d'etat, indeed, in the country. And perhaps the only reason why it didn't happen is because a large part of the military said, you know what? Not worth it. Honestly, that's why. Otherwise, it would have happened. So, they had the proof. So I think Brazil took a different stance than he did in the past and said, well, he needs to go to the Supreme Court. And in the end, of course, by a large majority, I have to say, he's being sentenced for 27 years. It's been a very serious accusation, but quite a historic decision because we never actually sentenced a former leader for a coup d'etat. Brazil and in the rest of the world, I think it's quite a rare thing to do as well for a former leader.
It's been a week or so since the sentence was passed, so I guess some time for it to sink in among Brazil's people, in particular among Jair Bolsonaro's supporters, of whom there are many. Millions of Brazilians turned out to vote for him to be president again at the most recent election. What kind of response are we seeing from his supporters? Is there any indication of him being turned into a martyr, or is there perhaps even any indication that quite a plurality of his supporters have gone, actually, you know what, it's all probably fair enough?
Well, I wouldn't say quite that, but one thing I was surprised, the reaction has been a bit muted. So there were no massive protests in Brasilia against the decision of the Supreme Court. Having said that, even looking at the polls, I mean, this has been good news for Lula. There was a little uptick in his approval rating, but there's still a lot of supporters for Bolsonaro. So let's say if he would be the candidate, he would probably go to the second round. I don't think he would win the election. But let's say 30% of the Brazilian electorate that would vote with him. But let's not forget that unlike in the United States, there is a part of the Brazilian right that maybe wouldn't vote for Bolsonaro, maybe just, and they're kind of expecting a new name to come up, which probably that's what's going to happen. So yes, Bolsonaro is popular, but not as much as people think. I mean, it's 30%, it's not half of the country, I would say.
So where do you think the energy attached to him goes now? Because a bit like Trump in the United States, which is the obvious compare and contrast that this episode is getting into, it wasn't just about Bolsonaro the man. There was a movement attached to him. There was a Bolsonaroism, or whatever it was you were calling it. Where does that go now?
Well, I think the Brazilian right, they're quite smart in that sense. There are already names. I mean, every day that I read the newspapers, there are who is going to be the candidate from the right. But one thing that is still unclear is Bolsonaro cannot be a candidate. I think that's for sure. So there will be either someone from his family or his wife even, Michele Bolsonaro. She's never been a politician. Although she's charismatic, she's an evangelical woman. She's a bit younger, and his sons as well, Eduardo Bolsonaro, who is an MP, currently living in the US, which is a bit strange. And he has another son who is a senator, Flávio Bolsonaro. But I think the surname Bolsonaro is already a little bit, they might be a vice president. But my bet would be that Tarcísio de Freitas, he's a more or less popular governor of the state of São Paulo, the wealthiest in the nation. He is more center-right, but let's not forget, he was a minister under Bolsonaro, and it was thanks to Bolsonaro that he was elected. And he does say that if he wins the presidency, he would pardon Bolsonaro from this accusation. So I think there's still lots of discussion in the Brazilian right about this.
I mean, that offer of a pardon for Bolsonaro notwithstanding, is there, do you think, optimism in Brazil that this benchmark having been laid down will keep even the most, I guess, rowdy and rumbustious populist within the law? Because people do now know that these laws are, well, they know that literally nobody is above them and there are consequences for breaking them.
Absolutely, absolutely. But it does make me feel a bit stressed seeing that Tarcísio de Freitas already said that he will pardon Bolsonaro. I don't know the legality of that, how this could happen. Of course, I'm very happy with the sentence. I think Brazil took quite a brave step in today's world. But depending on the result of next year's presidential elections, things they can change. So it depends on how much the right would have the majority to change things as well.
I want to return to that obvious compare-contrast that this episode, to a large extent, is doing between Brazil and the United States. We had the example of the United States not prosecuting Donald Trump, at least not for his role in the insurrection of January 6, 2021 versus what Brazil has done. What's your read on why Brazil has been much more robust about this? Is there perhaps less complacency in a country like Brazil, which has experience within living memory of there being really no civil institutions, of being a literal military dictatorship, versus the United States, which has now had nearly 250 years of thinking, yeah, we're a constitutional republic, everybody understands that, it'll be fine.
Absolutely. There was, I think Brazil, we have a history, a very recent past. I was born, let's say, in 86, 1 year after the end of the military dictatorship. So it's super recent still. I'm not calling myself young here, Andrew, but I think you're absolutely right. And I think Brazil is in a very lucky position to do that as well, even with our relationship with Trump. Because if we depended a little bit more from the US, maybe everything would be different. Maybe Lula would have to concede a few things, even with...
Because obviously President Trump has taken this very personally for fairly obvious reasons.
And I don't know what he's going to do actually in the next weeks, depending, because Bolsonaro is not in jail yet. I think by December he will be. We don't have a specific date. So, of course, he can, he's a very unpredictable man. as you know. But yeah, I think Brazil, we have relationships with China, with Europe. Our economy will, even if with the tariffs, I don't think it's going to affect us that much, as at least what Trump was expecting. So,
and these are tariffs that President Trump imposed specifically because he was annoyed at the treatment of Bolsonaro.
Exactly. It was a strictly political decision. It was not an economic decision at all.
I just want to close finally by, I guess, how you've seen this as a Brazilian outside Brazil, whether it has registered in Brazil that there's actually been, I think, an uptick in Brazil's image overseas. I think, again, comparing with the United States, people are pretty impressed that Brazil has taken this line and said, an election result is an election result. It is there to be respected, and people who act outside the law will be punished, whoever they are.
Absolutely. And I can see this positive. And you know what, Andrew, looking back since Brazil became a democracy again, we've been through so much. We've been through impeached presidents. We have, of course, Bolsonaro planning a coup d'etat. Even our current president has been in jail for almost 2 years. So there's been a lot of challenges, against our democracy, but we are holding up for now.
Fernando Augusto Pacheco, thanks for joining us. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. The 21st century has seen an extraordinary proliferation of scoundrels and scofflaws rising to national leadership, even in hitherto orderly democracies. Not only Trump and Bolsonaro, but Orban, Duterte, Johnson and Zuma, among others. The quest for their pathfinder and godfather often stops at Silvio Berlusconi, the unembarrassable Italian plutocrat who was 3 times prime minister and by his own count at least 106 times a defendant without ever spending a night in prison. It is arguable, however, that at least as chaotic and cautionary an example was set by Charlie Haughey, who dominated Irish politics for decades, 3 times a Taoiseach, while flaunting a lifestyle difficult to reconcile with a career public servant's wages. Well, joining me now is Gary Murphy, Professor of Politics at Dublin City University and the author of the biography Haughey. Gary, first of all, and I realise even as I ask it, this is probably not an easy question to answer quickly, but how would you assess the scale of what Charlie Haughey was able to get away with?
I think the scale of what Charles Haughey was able to get away with in terms of the monies he received from private donors was quite extraordinary and unparalleled, really, in the history of modern Ireland in particular, and probably on a global scale pretty high up there. He was a man who, between the years of 1979, when he first became Taoiseach of Ireland, and 1992, when he retired as Taoiseach. He wasn't Taoiseach for the whole of those 13 years, but he was Taoiseach 3 times, received some £9 million in donations from various individuals. He was the subject of a number of tribunals later on when this came to light, these monies came to light, and it was rather extraordinary, really.
I mean, a lot of this happened during times, certainly when I happened to be spending quite a bit of time in Ireland. And it struck me when it unravelled that nobody was really surprised, because the scale on which he lived on an Irish public sector wage had all been common knowledge, that he had a beautiful manor farm, a stud farm, a private island, a yacht. I think there may have been a helicopter. Why didn't that sort of, I guess, catch up with him before it did?
There are a few reasons. One is that there was a tremendous view in Ireland for many years, mostly amongst the people who voted for Charlie Haughey, that if Haughey could live in these circumstances, well, then perhaps I could live in them as well. And so there was no great urgency, let's put it like that, from the body politic in particular, to investigate the sources of his wealth. So there was no great investigative zeal. The revenue commissioners did investigate a land deal he had been in the late 1960s and found that there was nothing to see here. And on the private side, then, Andrew, an important point is when he became more and more a senior figure in Irish politics, he was able to use that sort of deference to authority to basically threaten the bank. So Allied Irish Bank, and I've been through every single letter in Haughey's archive, and there are various letters from him congratulating him on becoming Minister for Finance, on Taoiseach, whatever. There are no letters about their demands for money, but they did write to him seeking his money back, and he told him he could be a very troublesome adversary. Every now and again he would sell off little bits of land. He would have his accountant, a man called Des Traynor, who's a very important person when it all goes wrong for Haughey. He would have him basically pay off some of the debt, but that debt would then exponentially increase when he would do things like buy an island, buy art, buy expensive wine.
How much of Haughey's career of getting away with it, though, because I think it is a question that applies to other charismatic demagogues, if you will, how much of it was force of personality, that despite the fact that he was a fairly obvious scoundrel and an absolutely astonishing crook, people still, for some reason, liked him? They found him charming or amusing or at least entertaining.
Yeah, so in 1970 he was arrested. He had been charged basically with treason against the state for allegedly importing arms for the IRA. He was acquitted by a jury, and he had that sort of that taste of sulphur surrounded him and attracted many people to him. So he was a very charismatic, controversial figure who somehow revelled in it. He was very attractive to women in particular. He had a huge female following, voting, and I think, as I said earlier, a lot of people looked at Haughey. They looked at the mansion. They looked at the island. They looked at the obvious wealth, the expensive suits, and said, well, if Mr. Haughey can have it, coming from a very poor background, which he did come from a very poor background, well, maybe I can do it too.
But what we wanted to get into especially was whether there's a legacy attached to having had somebody like this at large in a country's political system for so long. Has there been, I guess, a lasting, as you put it, whiff of sulphur about Irish politics ever since? Or have people, I guess, learnt from the example and cleaned house?
Yeah, I would say it's the latter. I would think the Irish body politic now has a significant archipelago of devices to ensure our politics is clean. We have whistleblower legislation, we have regulation of lobbyists, we have regulation of donations during election time. So we have a pretty significant barriers, I would say, to political corruption. But on Haughey, it must be remembered, when he left office in 1992, he went with the good wishes of pretty much the whole of the population, except those who truly thought he was a sort of South American or Latin American dictator. It all unravels in 1996 when the payment of £1.3 million from the supermarket magnate Ben Dunn becomes clear, and it unravels. He is arrested again for the second time in 1999 and charged with misleading a tribunal of inquiry which was investigating him. But those charges were subsequently dropped because it was assumed or seen that he could not get a fair trial. But in the aftermath of these tribunals of inquiry, we have two long-running tribunals of inquiry which basically lasted from the late 90s to 2011. But subsequent to that, I would think over the course of the last decade in particular, the Irish state has put in place some significant measures to ensure its politics is clean. Now, I'm long enough teaching and writing and thinking about politics to know politics can never be clean. But I do think the Irish state, with what it's put in place in terms of things like capping donations, regulation of lobbyists, whistleblower legislation, freedom of information, has done a pretty good job in ensuring that people who vote now can be assured that those they are voting for are pretty clean.
Because it does strike me, just finally, that you can see echoes of Haughey, his character and his conduct, in quite a lot of more recent, or indeed some current politicians. You think perhaps most obviously of Silvio Berlusconi, Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, as well as Jair Bolsonaro. Do you think, though, that somebody of Haughey's general character, charisma, political skill could flourish in Ireland now in the same way that Haughey did?
And no, I don't. And I think it's simply because the media is now far too open and less deferential than it was. Private Eye used to often run a column about hockey and talk about his clear wealth and the scoundrel nature of him, and this was dismissed as sort of British tricks. But in the age of social media now, it simply could not happen. I think that a person could be beholden, as hockey clearly was, to a number of private benefactors. But he certainly saw himself as the equivalent of people like Thatcher, Mitterrand, Kohl. He saw himself as a global statesman, and in that context, he thought he deserved to live the life of a great global statesman, hence the large mansion, hence the beautiful cut suits, hence the opulent lifestyle. He always claimed, of course, that he wasn't corrupt, that he gave no public decisions or no favours for the monies, but I'm afraid the vast majority of Irish people felt differently.
That was Gary Murphy, Professor of Politics at Dublin City University and the author of Haughey. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Joining me finally is Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld, Senior Fellow in the Democracy, Conflict and Governance Programme at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Rachel, first of all, is there one simple reason why President Trump was never prosecuted for his role in the events of January 6th, 2021?
You know, America's very polarized, and it's very hard to come to agreement about basic facts. I think if there had not been an attempt to impeach prior to that, there might have been more support for impeaching then. But it's not clear because it had gotten so politicized by then.
So do you think the sense is that the Department of Justice under President Biden kind of slow-walked it in the hope that maybe Trumpism would burn out or he would lose the 2024 election as well and this whole thing would take care of itself?
I don't have any inside knowledge into how the Biden Justice Department thought about their situation. It is hard to figure out quite what to do when leaders of a government have broken the law or are suspected of breaking the law, because, of course, you want to uphold the norms and you want nobody to be above the law. And you have to respect the fact that someone was democratically elected and that they still have supporters. And you also don't want to create such high barriers to leaving office that no one wants to leave office. It's pretty important that you move people out of office if they get voted out. So it's a difficult thing.
And probably it is reasonable to suppose perhaps that there was a slight terror of going through the whole, the trouble and difficulty and rancor that would have attended putting him on trial and then him being acquitted.
You know, he was on trial a few times in various different cases, and in some he was convicted, in some he was acquitted, and some they sort of stayed the cases. It's just a very difficult decision. How do you prosecute someone who's a leader, and how do you do it fairly so that the settlement or the decision is not seen as politicized?
Has the failure to prosecute Trump, do you think, made it more difficult to impose the law or at least enforce the law even to the people who are at the top of government?
I think it is imperative to enforce the law for people up and down government. Again, no one can be above the law. I actually don't think that whether Trump himself was prosecuted or not has much to do with that. It's particularly hard to prosecute a head of state and much easier to prosecute people lower down the line. I think the problem that we're having in general with this is the polarization of the public. We don't agree on facts. And if you don't agree on facts, if you're getting vastly different news, it's just very hard to come up with a prosecution that feels just and that won't be rejected by a large portion of the democratic citizenry.
I mean, how significant a moment, though, does it now feel like the decision recently reached by the Supreme Court to the effect that the occupant of the White House effectively is above the law is going to prove not just for the rest of Trump's term, but beyond?
Well, I can't say I like the decision. I helped write an amicus brief against it, along with many other democracy scholars, just why this was so important to have leaders held accountable. The Supreme Court decision doesn't actually say that. What it actually says is we do have a lot of latitude for an executive to make decisions. And as long as those decisions are seen as having something to do with their government responsibilities, they're not going to be held personally liable. That it's an issue of interpretation. You don't want heads of state to be prosecuted for things they do as part of their government. You do want heads of state to be prosecuted for breaking laws. Obviously, those two things cannot both hold at the same time. And so you have a lot of room for judicial discretion, for politics, and for very hard decisions. I think the decision with Bolsonaro that he was arrested but left under house arrest in a very nice situation, that might be a very good way to handle this kind of thing, that it's a norm that's upheld, but you're not seeing your former president in prison clothes and a small cell. That seems like a more appropriate way to handle it.
But is there a concern, though, in particular in the American context, for people who are fans of that original idea of checks and balances, the three co-equal branches of government, that one of them, i.e. the executive, is now way overburdened or indeed overprivileged with power, and that might be hard to bring back? Because if there is one constant of human history, it's that once people have any amount of power, they rarely part with it voluntarily.
I think it will be very hard to bring back. Our first populist president, Andrew Jackson, made a number of grabs for greater executive power, and that was never reversed. He forced line item vetoes on Congress. He rejected a Supreme Court ruling, and it was basically impossible to put the genie back in the bottle with Congress, although the Supreme Court did reassert itself later. Now we have a situation in which the court, which has always given a lot of deference to presidents in foreign policy, is giving just a really large amount of deference to this idea of a unitary executive, the idea that the president kind of controls the whole executive branch instead of having internal checks and balances within the executive branch. This is really dangerous as a theory because it means that you move toward a more personalistic kind of rule, a one-man rule, not just that his party is in control, it was voted in, that seems fair, but that a singular person is above checks and balances within the executive. And that just doesn't go well. When countries have that kind of rule, they tend to become pretty incompetent and corrupt over time.
Well, just finally on that thought, because we have recently seen the President of the United States here in the United Kingdom visiting a descendant of the king that your people took the trouble to overthrow about 250 years ago. Do you think the last few years have maybe revealed that a surprising plurality of Americans, it turns out, are actually quite comfortable with the idea of a king or something fairly close to it?
You know, I don't think that most Americans want a king, but I think many Americans are so scared of the other side that they do not want the other side in power. It's a different thing, but it ends up in a similar place. Lily Mason and Nathan Calmo just did some, they're scholars of political violence, and they just did some polling where they've been doing it since 2017, asking various questions to the electorate that are the same. And they find that 80% of the electorate, about equal on both sides, now is in such fear of the other party that they just can't really imagine being governed by them. That's how you end up with a situation where you can't prosecute a leader for breaking the law, or where you have support for a kind of king-like president. And that's where we are right now. And it's about taking down the fear, not just the hatred, that is so important in America right now.
But just as a final thought, how threatening is that to the future of the rule of law, which is supposed to be impartial? Lady Justice famously wears a blindfold. That it's become subservient to the superstitions of the people.
Norms are always subservient to the beliefs of the human populace of a country. And America is a country largely built on norms. We have a very short and very old constitution. It changes very rarely. And rather than spelling out lots and lots of ways to constrain the government the way that constitutions that were written after World War II in Europe do, It has very few rules and a lot of history that's built up over time about how one functions in a democracy, how you trust the opposition to be a loyal opposition, to not be treasonous just for opposing a government, how you share power, how the minority in power gets a lot of say through things like the filibuster in the Senate. As all of these norms degrade and degrade and degrade, it's very hard to get them back through law.
Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.